now?
Well, I'm mainly retired and I do a lot of voluntary work, but I also have a recording studio which somebody else runs, and I'm a sort of landlord, mini landlord.
Wow, that's very interesting. Luckily you're an author, so you should be very good at describing things. Let's start out finding out about life when you were a little boy. So, what is your earliest memory?
My earliest memory, and I'm not sure whether it's a memory or it's something that somebody told me, but it happened just after the war started. I was just over 2 when the war started, and between the age of 2 and 3 there was a period where, although we were at war with Germany, absolutely nothing happened. It was called the phony war. Any day we were expecting bombs to be falling on London by their hundreds, but absolutely nothing happened. And in fact, some children were evacuated from London before any bombs fell. They were actually evacuated before the war was declared, a few weeks before the war was declared. And after this phony war started, they all came back, because there wasn't a war. But I was apparently, this is what I was told, it's not a real memory, my dad had a fish and chip shop, a very, very popular one, in the East End of London. And one day, I was playing in the street outside. You didn't have to worry about cars and things. Probably about 3 then. And there's a big queue in the shop. And everybody was worried about the point at which the war would start. And I ran into the shop, and I was shouting out, "Air raid! Air raid!" And everybody ran. All my dad's customers ran out of the shop. My dad was not pleased. But that is the first thing I can remember when I was about 2.
Do you remember why you said you came in shouting air raid? Was it actually an air raid, or was it maybe your first word? Or
I don't think it was my first words. I'm sure my first words were mama and dada. But I obviously heard everybody talking about it. So that's why I did it.
Very interesting. What was life like in London when you were very little? What was life like?
Well,
how were the streets in London when the war had actually started?
Well, I can't remember that. I was much too young. You know, you're talking about 75 years ago. I can remember the first memory I've got of the bombs is much later, as when I was about 5. But life in London was very hard for people, that I do know, and every time there was a bombing raid, and sometimes there were bombing raids night after night after night, and as many as 1,000 people could be killed in every single bombing raid, which was why the government decided to evacuate not just the children but also their mums, and while the dads were in the army.
So, what was your family like during the war? Were they very panicky, or were they quite calm, telling you that everything was going to be all right, or were they very panicky?
I don't remember them being panicky. It was just me and my mum in those days, and my brother and sister were born much later. I don't remember them being panicky. There was one occasion while we were evacuated. We were evacuated to a town called Welling City to start with, now known as Old Welling, and then later we went to Welling Garden City. And there was an occasion while I was shopping in the main Welling Garden City shopping centre on a Saturday afternoon. It was a bright sunny day, and I heard a strange noise, and people started screaming and running around, not knowing what to do. And then I looked up, and there in the sky, very low down, was a German plane.
Wow, that must have been very scary. Could you describe any emotions that
I don't remember any emotions. I'm sure I was as scared as anybody else. But actually what happened was that the pilot of that plane, he really didn't want to be in the war, so he flew his plane and landed it in a field and got out and said, "I'm going to take me prisoner." And then we all went and climbed into the plane afterwards and had a jolly good time.
Ah, that must have been fun. What happened to the pilot? Did he just let you go in his plane, or was he taken away?
By that time he'd been taken away, yes. We went into the plane a few days later.
Ah, so you were evacuated with your mum?
I was evacuated with my mum, and those days it wasn't a question of finding that we didn't have to find someone to be evacuated to. The government sent out a letter to various people who they knew had lots of rooms, and they said, on such and such a day, you will find that Mr. and Mrs. Goldstein, which is what my name was at the time, will come down with their son, and you will have to put them up. No, you didn't. It was the law that they had to put us up. So my dad actually went into the army before then. He went to Wales. My mum and I went to this place in Olivia Project, and she was a horrible lady, this lady. We were there for a relatively short time. But while we were there, my father came back from leave, and in those days, all they used to get was 24 hours, a 24-hour pass, which meant he had to get all the way from Wales on a train to see my mum in Welling, and then go back. And then he got to the door, rang the doorbell, and the lady of the house came down, and she said yes, and he said, I've come to see my wife and son. And she said, I'm not having men come into my house. And she said, my mum and I had to go out to see my dad. She wouldn't let a man who was defending her country come into her house.
That must have been very shocking for you.
Well, I honestly don't remember it, to be perfectly honest, but I do think it was very shocking for anyone, really. I know it was upsetting for my mum, yeah.
So what was the house that you were staying in like?
Don't remember. Later, when we moved, we had our own house in a place called Longcroft Green in Welling City, which was a new city, a new town. It was a small house. We had 2 bedrooms and a little narrow sitting room. And then the main thing I remember about it was that I got a dog.
You got a dog? Do you remember what type?
Well,
Because I bet those memories would go through your head.
It was a mongrel. It was a mongrel. And the only thing and we used to have a garden, and I used to play with it in the garden. And one day, when I was very, very little, we were playing a sort of rough play, and the dog bit my hand and it was bleeding. And I started to cry, and the dog started to cry.
Aww.
That was very sad. The dog was actually crying.
So what did you eat? What did you play with? What did you do every day?
Well, as soon as I was old enough, I went to school. The school was 2 minutes walk away around the corner, and I used to walk there on my own, even sort of like it was the early infants. And that was, the other things. There was no television. We used to listen to the radio a bit. I had a favourite little tiny dinky car that I played with all the time. And there was a little boy who lived immediately opposite me, who I used to go and play with quite often. Food, well, my mum always used to make nice food because she was working. She used to go to work every single day, which meant going from Welling Garden City, the new town, to Stratford in the east of London. So she had a 2-hour journey by train there and a 2-hour journey back. And she would go and run the fish and chip shop, and she would always come back with fish and chips for us to eat every day.
But wasn't food still being rationed? So how would you get your fish, and how would you get... Well, chips would have been easy because they're basically made out of potatoes and deep fried. But how would you get that oil, and how would you get the fish? Would you fish for your own fish, or...?
No, you would get... As far as I understand, fish and chip shops were given special privileges, were given the oil, because you couldn't get meat at all. There's no meat to speak of. That was all went to the army. So the ordinary people of the country had to eat a lot of fish, which was why my parents' shop was so successful. But they were given an allocation of oil and an allocation of fish. And always, my mum always just found the odd couple of pieces of fish to take home. Not every day. Sometimes we had egg and chips like everyone else, But I think we might have even had baked beans sometimes.
So once all your siblings were born, how old were they when the war was actually over? How old were you all when the war was actually over?
Right. Well, the war was over in 1945, and I was born in 1937. So I would have been about 8. Can't do the maths. I think it was about 8. And my brother was about 2. My sister wasn't born yet.
Oh, so your sister hasn't experienced any life of the war?
None at all.
Well, that must be lucky for her, so she didn't have to go through all the hard work and all the worry that you had to go through. Thank you, that's very fascinating. So now let's just talk about World War II in general. So where were you living in 1939 when the war actually broke out? Do you remember which street?
Yes, but I was living in Let Road, Stratford, which has been destroyed now and is part of the Olympic Park in Stratford in
Ooh.
East London. It was quite a nice road, and I was living above a fish and chip shop. My parents' fish and chip shop.
So above it. Do you know when when the road got destroyed?
Well, quite recently when the Olympic Village was built.
Oh. So in around 2000, was the fish and chip shop still there, and was it still open?
No, it closed probably, I would have said about 1950, and my dad opened another shop in the East End of London, another fish and chip shop.
Well, do you have any... Well, who else was living with you at home after the war?
My mum and dad, and then my little brother.
So when was your sister born?
My sister was born 1950, I think.
And how old is she now? She must be around 65? Yes, what?
67, yeah.
Yeah,
67, yeah.
Wow. And who decided that you should leave London? Was it your mum who decided, or was it just a law that one day a letter came to your house saying you need to go, you need to be evacuated?
I think people were given the option. I think if you wanted to leave London, which most people did, to be honest, it was terrible. Every street you looked down was just full of rubble, and people were dying every night. So I think people were given the option, and like millions of others, my mum took the option to take me away out of London.
So how long did you stay in the new place where you were evacuated to?
So I think we were probably evacuated in 1941, and we stayed there until 1944. So we were there for 3 years altogether.
So who went? Did both of your parents go with you at first, or did your father go away to war before you were evacuated?
My father was already in the army in Wales.
So it was just you and your mum being evacuated. So did other relations or friends leave with you, or to go to other places?
Most of my cousins were evacuated somewhere or other. Some of them didn't go very far. Some of them just went as far as Watford. But they all went somewhere, yeah.
Did your family discuss what was going on in the world, or did they just keep it quiet from you?
I don't think, well, I was very, very young. And obviously later on, when I was 6 or 7, it was different. But I don't think that they burdened me with any of the horrible things that were going on. They tried to shield me.
Where did you get that information from? TV, newspaper?
There was no TV.
Yes.
There was no TV at all until after the war. So I would have probably just got it from my mum. I couldn't read in those days.
Oh. How did you find out that the war was over?
Well, by the time the war was over in 1945, I was 7 or 8, so it was everywhere. Everybody was shouting about it, and the radio was on about it, and everyone was talking, and the neighbours were talking, and it was a huge celebration.
Was there lots of street parties and everything?
Yeah.
For how long? How many days did the celebration go on for?
I don't remember.
Well, it must have been a very joyful time. And do you remember if after the war, for how long food was still being rationed?
I think it was as long as 10 years, maybe even longer.
Wow.
Yeah.
So did you move back to the same house?
No, we went to a place called Stanmore. We didn't go back to Stratford at all.
So what did your new house look like?
It was beautiful. It was a great big house.
Well, what did London look like?
Well, it depended where you were in London. Most of the bombs fell in quite a small area near the docks, the London docks, which is where my parents and my parents' family lived, in the East End of London. But if you were further out, if you were in places like Stanmore, there weren't that many bombs. But after we moved back into Stanmore, it was at the end of the war, and that's the time of the doodlebugs. Have you heard about the doodlebugs?
No, tell me more. What are the doodlebugs?
The doodlebugs are rockets that the Germans sent out at the end of the war. There was the V1.